Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me, as always, delighted to have Fabian Zuleeg, CEO and Chief Economist at the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, as we discuss a huge range of things. The outcome of that informal EU summit in Cyprus late last week, unfolding events in the Middle East, the state of EU-US relations, the outcome of the Hungarian elections and its implications for the EU, but also crucially for the war in Ukraine, the latest developments on the negotiations on the EU's long-term budget. And taking all of this into account, consider what signs we are seeing of the capacity, the ability of EU leaders to navigate a way through these multiple storms. As always, totally interactive discussion. I have some questions for Fabian and Janis. If you have questions, you can either write them using the Q&A box, not the chat, please, or you can click on the raised hands button and I'll try to come to you later on. Let us dive straight in and let's start with the informal summit, Janis, in Cyprus last week. Why was it called? What was on the agenda, and where did they actually focus their conversations? Just to put our discussion this afternoon in some context.
Yeah, sure. Well, it has become a tradition to have these informal summits, especially on the invitation of a council presidency, in this case, Cyprus. It is an opportunity to have an open, strategic exchange. Sometimes it becomes less strategic because you're overwhelmed by current developments. There are no conclusions, there are no decisions which are taken. So that puts less pressure on the discussions. With respect to the concrete agenda, they started in the afternoon, had a dinner, and then had a half day the following day. It started with a meeting with the Ukraine President Zelensky, which has become, as we now know, a tradition, showing support with respect to Ukraine, also issues related to membership, where Ukraine is very much pressing. And then they had a very extensive exchange, the 27 leaders, or it was less because Orban was not there. They had an exchange about geopolitics with a focus, obviously, on the Middle East. Then they had an exchange with respect to the need for more clarity regarding Article 42.7, the Mutual Assistance Clause. The second day started with a meeting with the President of the European Parliament, very short, 15 minutes only. And then they devoted attention to the MFF, to the Multiannual Financial Framework, which they should have discussed at the last ordinary European Council meeting, but they couldn't because they did not have the time to do so. So they used the informal summit to have that exchange. And following the conclusion of the informal meeting, they also had a meeting with leaders of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. So they had a packed agenda in a rather short period of time. Since then, things have happened. So there's a good reason to talk about what happened at the summit, but also afterwards.
Absolutely. And let us turn to the issue that is occupying most of the headlines and most of all of our thoughts at the moment, the war in the Middle East. In terms of that, and just to follow up with you, Janis, and then I'll come to you, Fabian, in terms of what they talked about in the Middle East, was the emphasis on discussing the geopolitical situation and the potential role of the EU in all of this, or was it more on the economic fallout? Where was the balance of that conversation?
I think it was both. They did discuss the security situation and the geopolitical consequences and what potentially might happen and what the EU could do about it. But they also, obviously, giving how many economic consequences it already has, and even worse, how many economic consequences it might potentially have if this drags on, if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. It will definitely have economic consequences, already has, but the question is how big of a consequences it will have. So they discussed both elements, and it's also difficult to keep them separate from each other.
Well, indeed, indeed. And Fabian, I mean, in both cases, the big question, what role can the EU play? I mean, when you take it on the geopolitical front and the de-escalation of a conflict that now appears to be, you have peace negotiations on, off again. The Americans are flying in, the Iranians are flying in, now they're not. And now today we see threats from the US again to ramp up attacks. Question on the geopolitical, the security side, of whether the EU can do anything to help de-escalate, and on the economic side, what, if anything, what levers the EU has to pull to try and prevent this from turning into a full-scale economic crisis. How do you read in broad terms both? And then we can delve into some of the detail.
I think it's a bit more nuanced. We have to look at what can the EU do, but what that certainly is not is turning the tide when it comes to the war itself or when it comes to the global economic impact the war has. So in a sense, the EU will have to react rather than being the one which is driving the developments. But within that reaction, there is scope for EU agency. One thing we have seen is that the EU, for example, and here we are talking about the member states, have chosen not to support this war, even though they have, of course, reiterated that they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but that they don't believe that this is the right way, which has also led to a number of countries not allowing the US to use their airspace in this, of course, triggering a response from the US. We also have seen that there's more discussion around mutual defense, 42.7. Clearly, the question was also particularly relevant because of Cyprus and being involved there. There is also a discussion of what comes after the hot phase in this, given that Europeans have to continue to rely on the oil coming through the Strait of Hormuz. So I think there's a recognition that even though we didn't cause the mess, we are going to have to help clean it up at the end. So there are a number of things which European countries can do. On the other side, clearly, the high energy prices are already impacting very negatively on European economies. We've seen growth forecasts being cut. We are going to see more of that in many ways. It's probably inevitable now that we have a global downturn rather than a short crisis, which a lot of people had hoped. But of course, still depending on how long this phase in the war continues. But we know from previous periods that in the end, yes, European leaders can try to cushion the impact of the increasing energy prices, but there are quite strong limits to that on the
Indeed,
fiscal side, on the energy market side, also because we already had higher energy prices in Europe than in most other competitor regions.
Let's talk in a moment about what's on the table on the economic side. But Janis, from your perspective, Antonio Costa said after the informal meeting, the EU is not part of the conflict, but we will be part of the solution. I'm going to ask you somewhat cynically, will we really be part of that solution?
Well, it depends on what kind of solution will be found at the end. But as Fabian said, there's a role that Europeans will be playing collectively, maybe partially through the EU, but also individually, including also non-European countries. So Europeans will play a part, whether that then is part of the solution or part of cleaning up the mess that will have been created through actions committed by others, is a big question mark. But I think what is important is that Europeans have defined what their priorities are. That was also something which Costa reiterated following the end of the informal summit when he was saying we have three main priorities. One is to restore the freedom of navigation, which obviously is key from a European perspective, given the economic fallout. And let's also not forget it's also about fertilizers, which are not being now distributed throughout the world. Then the priority of trying to work towards a stable and lasting ceasefire. in order to, as the Costa was saying, as the EU leaders are agreeing to pave the way for a sustainable peace in the region, which is a high aim, and linking that also to the fact that European EU leaders have acknowledged the fact that a stable Middle East will also require that Iran is not nuclear armed. And that's where also big opposition is to President Trump, who argues that we are actually saying that, but we're not doing what we need to do. But we have a totally different opinion of what the right way of doing that would be. So there are a lot of question marks, and that really depends on how things will develop in the upcoming weeks and months. But we will be part of whatever happens after the fighting will end at some
Sure.
point in
Sure.
time.
But one specific, Fabian, issue that is being discussed is what is being called a multilateral defensive mission on the Straits of Hormuz to be part of cleaning up that mess, as you put it, quotes, when the necessary security conditions are met. This is a coalition. We talk increasingly these days about coalitions of the willing. This is a coalition involving over 50 countries potentially. So within that, do you see a specific role for the EU? Or doesn't it matter? And should we not get hung up on whether the EU itself is playing a part or whether we are talking about Europeans more broadly?
I think in this particular case, we should really focus on the outcomes we need to see. And in many ways, having a global coalition involved in some form would also, in most circumstances, make the situation more stable. Iran will, at least with some countries, be more careful than with other countries, as we have already seen. So just having those who Iran might see on the other side involved would not be helpful. I think this is very much also a reflection on in how far this is an area where Europe has a significant influence. I would say that if we look at something like Ukraine and Russia, there it is extremely important that Europe is at the table. Here, I think the most important thing for Europe is that we restore the flow through the Strait of Hormuz. And whatever role Europe can play in that is simply subordinate to that overall goal.
Thank you. I just
But
wanted to, yeah, sorry, Janis.
just to add, but I would also imagine that there will be a solution found where obviously the coalitions of the willing, this big global coalition, is
Yeah.
going to be key. But I think that the solution will be found where there will also be a role for the European Union and its naval missions by extending them, by extending post or involving these missions also in something which contributes to the situation in the wider area. So it will be also something where, let's call it simply, a European Union flag will also be involved.
Okay. Just coming back, I want to talk more broadly about relations with the US, particularly in this context, and then we'll come on to Ukraine after that. But before we do, just going back to the economic question, Fabian, and the Commission did come up with a package of proposals, including relaxing state aid rules, including what they call Accelerate EU, the strategy relating to clean energy, homegrown energy. I mean, how much? Antonio Costa said this would provide both immediate and more structural relief to EU citizens and businesses. How significant were those proposals, and what impact, positive or potentially in the case of loosening state aid rules, could they have? How do you read that package of measures, and how effective it would be?
I think what we're seeing is a mixture of short-term measures which are aiming, um, in most cases, to allow member states to take actions which they might want to choose to take in these circumstances. It's not only that, there is also a question, for example, about joint gas procurement, which is intended to control the price spikes a bit. But we also have this other side, the longer term action, the idea that if we move away from our dependence on fossil fuels, then of course these kind of situations would be less impactful, less threatening to us. But we know that that second part will take a much longer period of time. It doesn't happen overnight. And the dependencies we now have are going to be painful in this situation because we shouldn't forget that we replaced some of the dependencies we had on Russian fossil fuels with dependencies on Middle Eastern fossil fuels. So if we are now deprived of both of those, then inevitably there will be an impact. And I think that's where also leaders need to be, I think, a bit clearer with their populations. That especially if this becomes protracted, which it looks like it is, there is going to be a structural impact, which these measures will not be able to cushion on a permanent basis.
I was going to ask you, Janis, in terms of how this plays into the political debate within Europe and to the strength of populist forces, and whether there is a danger here of the EU raising expectations of what it can do to mitigate the impacts of this crisis among citizens, which will inevitably be disappointed. Do you see that as a risk for the EU if they put a great deal of emphasis on their role in all of this?
There is always a risk, but I think there is no alternative. The EU and member states individually and collectively, and that's important because, as Fabian was saying, a lot of the actions which are being taken are going to and are individual from a member state's perspective. But even these things need to be coordinated. They need to be targeted. They also at times need to be temporary. And we've learned the lessons from 2022 war, Ukraine when it started, but also from the COVID crisis, that there is need to have a coordinated way of action, even if decisions and actions are being taken at the national level. But the European Union and its members need to showcase towards the population that they're trying, that they're preparing as much as they can. And sorry for that. And there's also, there are simple things like we do not know what the fuel situation is throughout Europe. So the creation of what they call a fuel observatory is something which is required in order to have a better picture of what the situation looks like. Because if this crisis is being prolonged, the economic effects will be devastating, potentially. And that obviously will have also political consequences. However, we know who caused the situation. So there is also the strong argument of, do you really want to support political forces on the extreme right who have been very close to Donald Trump? Is this really are these the saviors we're looking for?
Well,
So there
indeed, and
are.
we see Georgia Maloney, for example, beginning to distance herself very clearly from Donald Trump in reflection of that, and that brings us very much onto what I wanted to talk about, because you mentioned right at the start the fact that obviously, and we all know, EU member states have chosen not to support this war, not to get involved, but they're also now becoming increasingly vocal, indeed blunt, in their criticism of the war as it drags on, and most notably German Chancellor Merz's comments this week when he said the EU has, and I'm quoting, no truly convincing strategy in the negotiations, and also quoting, it is being humiliated by the regime in Tehran. And this predictably perhaps has prompted threats from Donald Trump today to remove troops from German soil. Two questions here, Fabian. The wisdom of becoming more vocal, more blunt in criticism of the war. It was always being said behind closed doors. Now it's being said in public. But also, is this increasing the open recognition of how badly relations with America have been damaged, translating into the necessary actions, i.e. the consequences of that damage? So a twofold question, the political wisdom of all of this, and what does it mean?
Well, I'll start with the second question, because I think it is very clear that there has been damage to the relationship, and that damage is deep. It's not simply a continuation of the spat we have seen before. There's something fundamental shifting. This is not entirely new, because I would argue that certainly with Greenland, we already saw some of this happening. But of course, now it's very much out in the open, also because when it comes to the direct involvement in this war, European countries do have a choice, whether they want to be in the front line as it is. So I think we are starting to see a real appreciation of what threat Trump actually poses for Europe. This is also, I think, when we see the actions like withdrawing troops from German soil. I would very much question or whether the outcome would have been different
Quite.
if we had supported Trump.
So does that mean it's right to be open, to be blunt about the situation, or not?
So I think there is more openness, which is useful, and I think this is also in part what is driving Merz, that he's trying to tell his domestic audience, look, we are changing things. But I think there is also a question of choosing your words carefully and not just simply putting out statements which you know are going to inflame the ire of Donald Trump. I think choosing words like humiliating, having no strategy, does simply invite retaliation. I think a slightly more diplomatic approach might be more helpful in this. But of course, there's the question of playing for your own domestic audience, but also the character of Chancellor Merz, who has a habit of coming out with statements like that, also in the domestic German debate, which often raise a lot of response. And actually, over the last few days, he's done it again on a number of different topics.
But Janis, he's not alone, really, in being more openly critical, perhaps blunter in that choice of words, as Fabian says, should he have used the word humiliation to a man like Donald Trump? Your assessment, but also this question then of whether this is finally, we've talked on many updates about, yes, Europe is waking up, but it's too slow. It's not drawing the implications in the way that it should. Do you feel that tide really is turning now? And you're muted. Oh, there we no.
Sorry
There we
for
go.
that, but I had a bit of a problem with my voice. First of all, I think we can see that there are differences of opinion among EU leaders, also in the way they are expressing themselves. But there's an increasing frustration, as you were saying, it was also already existing behind closed doors, but now it's becoming openly visible, which obviously also has to do with the fact that there is pressure coming from the national electorates who are frustrated with the situation and who have a rather clear opinion when it comes to Donald Trump. And if you look into opinion polls, you will see that in most member states, almost everywhere, that there's a clear negative opinion when it comes to Donald Trump. So that's also reflecting internal political dynamics. But there's also an increasing appreciation that only if you push back, at times maybe even fight back against some of the actions which the president has taken or potentially might be taken, will you be taken also serious? So there's a thin line here. At the same moment in time, Fabian is right. There are certain ways how you can put things and describing them rather clearly, by using different kind of wordings, which will not lead to the same reaction. But I think in the case of Chancellor Merz, one also needs to be aware of the fact that this is having already strong economic negative effects on Germany itself, and if it's prolonged, it will have even more negative effects, and that is really spoiling what he had planned in terms of his chancellorship. So
and in
there are
terms
a lot of
of
different reasons. And
and
by
in
the way,
terms of
just the last
waking up,
one.
hang on a minute. Yes, exactly. I want to just,
Exactly.
in terms of waking up to the implications of all this, you mentioned that there was this discussion on the potential use of the EU's mutual defence clause. Cyprus raised it in particular, asking for more clarity on how it works. There is also, of course, a huge and growing discussion about NATO's future, because again, we are seeing repeated threats, subtle or otherwise, to the future of NATO from Donald Trump. And I wanted to link them because the whole debate about where does Europe go and where does NATO go if what was unthinkable happens and the US withdraws from the alliance, the planning for the implications of this rupture. Janis, what's your reading of where we are and whether that's really being stepped up now?
Well, first of all, I think that even though there are differences among member states, also there are differences among how EU leaders are expressing themselves. I think there is a strong conviction that Europe needs to get its act together, that it needs to show a higher level of ambition when it comes to different fields. So I think that there's also this appreciation that the current situation, because of how difficult and dangerous it is also an opportunity to get things moving. The question is, how far will member states be ready to use that pressure which is now there in order to be able to implement certain of the decisions which they have been taken. Now, when it comes to defense mutual assistance, we now have obviously in more intense debate about what Article 42.7 actually means or can mean in practice. And that is something which has become a stronger need to have that debate because, as you were indicated earlier, the drone attack on Cyprus, the fact that the Cypriots have not invoked Article 42.7, but they have argued, and the president especially, we had him at an event a couple of weeks ago at the EPC, is very much pushing the debate to have a discussion about what the mutual assistance clause, not mutual defense, the mutual assistance clause might mean in practice, so that there is more clarity about what actually, not only what obligation other member states have, but how that will play out in practice. And to think that through, they had a discussion, as we said in the informal council, in the European Council meeting. The Cypriot president also shared his idea. The High Representative Kallas updated the European Council and members on ongoing work on the matter. So there's a discussion about how potentially 42.7 might be used in future, but we know that there are other member states, and there's the link to NATO, are fearful that 42.7 and making it more concrete potentially might further undermine NATO and especially Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And so even there you have differences of opinion and member states pushing in different directions, but I think we're going to get a bit more clarity with respect to 42.7 might mean in practice in future in case a member state evokes it again, because it had been evoked once in 2015 by the French government in the context of the November Paris attacks. So that already is an indication of one area where the discussion is moving. But the question is, if you will really need and evoke 42.7, what that will mean in practice if you now have more of a debate about it, at least.
Indeed. And Fabian, on this question, I should mention the EPC hosted a debate in London recently on what it called the Europeanization of NATO. Interesting report by Paul Taylor on the website about that event and that discussion. And the discussion here about whether there is a risk now, as Janis said, of undermining NATO by moving on parallel tracks, or whether that is inevitable, that we need to do that. We need to make those preparations because of the threat that the US is posing to NATO now. What is your reading of where that conversation is and where it should be indeed? How can the EU prepare for the potential withdrawal of the US without undermining NATO in the interim?
Well, I think firstly, we need to be clear that a certain process of, if you like, distancing is already happening because of the war. The US clearly is focused much more on the Middle East at this moment in time, but that also has very strong impacts on capacities. Certain weapons, certain systems, certain capabilities, which the US had previously put into the broader realm of NATO are simply not available anymore. So in some areas, we are going to have to go it alone, whether we want to or not. But I think beyond that, clearly, this is a moment where we have, and we have talked about that before in these updates, this unfortunate, if you like, timing problem. That yes, we can see that the US is distancing itself, but do we have the capabilities in Europe to step into the gap?
The answer is not yet.
And the answer is in many areas, it's not yet. In some areas, it's also about how we would do that because there's not a single player which could step into that gap. And that then also brings in the question you mentioned, the discussion we just had in London. Of course, it's also then relevant to say it is not as simple as saying EU steps in where NATO leaves, because European NATO involves countries which are not in the EU. We have countries within the EU which are not in NATO. So it's a very complex tapestry. But in the end, I think, and that would be my overall conclusion, I think European leaders have woken up to the reality that the US is becoming less engaged in Europe and is becoming less engaged in Ukraine, which means we will have to take much more responsibility, and that we also saw with the finalization of the loan to
I want to come to that in just a moment, but there are a couple of questions from the audience before we move on to Ukraine and in connection with that, the political developments in Hungary. But Dimitris Korpakis is saying, unless diplomatic moves are being deployed behind closed doors, we've not seen a meaningful diplomatic initiative from the EU to end the war with Iran or to open the Straits of Hormuz. Is this a good way to follow? I mean, I mentioned this developing multilateral defensive mission on the Straits of Hormuz being developed, but that developed under the leadership of Britain and France. And then from Philip Hamro-Drotz, would the EU or any coalition try to make pressure on Israel with the purpose to end this crisis? So two questions there, going back to, you said, Fabian, earlier, we have no choice but to react fundamentally. But two questions there suggesting the EU could be a little more proactive than it's being at the very least.
I do not see that the EU has, at this moment in time, any leverage over Netanyahu and his government. I think, yes, we should act. Incidentally, not only because of Iran, because we should not forget this is also affecting Lebanon. This continues to be a crisis in Gaza. So we are talking about a whole region which is in turmoil at this moment in time. But I simply do not think that the Israeli government would listen to anyone. Maybe with the exception of Donald Trump, but even that, it seems to be rather the other way around, at least so far. When it comes to diplomatic efforts, it in this current situation seems very much that the protagonists in this are not willing to listen to the EU on any of this.
So for the moment, there is little point trying to be proactive. Yeah.
I think we should be thinking about what will come after this. And that is where we should put our diplomatic efforts, because there are huge questions about what will come after it, including the question of how we manage the nuclear question with Iran in future, where Europeans have some experience, how we manage Israel's situation in future, because Israel is very isolated. Also, what will happen to the wider region? We just seen United Arab Emirates leaving OPEC, which is a very significant moment. So I think, yes, in the aftermath, there will be a lot to do. But at this moment in time, Pakistan is better placed to negotiate than we are.
Yeah, we need to move on, Janis. It's going to have to be a sentence. Sorry.
I think you need to prepare the aftermath. And let's be fair, they also had at this informal meeting a meeting with the leaders of, as I said earlier, Jordan, Lebanon,
Yeah,
Syria, Egypt, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. Costa and von der Leyen were in the region, had discussions. So these happen behind closed doors, but they are important also in order to prepare for the aftermath. The
indeed.
problem is we do not know when the aftermath will happen and what kind of aftermath we will be confronted with.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm sure we'll come back to this in our next update. But let me turn now to a moment of a rare moment of good news. Well, if you are a supporter of liberal democratic forces in Europe, good news, namely the defeat of Viktor Orban in Hungary, which has been greeted with huge relief in Brussels and in many national capitals. In broad terms, and then I want to talk about it more specifically relating to Ukraine. But in broad terms, how important, Janis, do you believe this victory by Peter Magyar is for the EU and for broadly its capacity to respond to all these challenges we're discussing here today and we're in focus at the summit?
I think it's very important. It is very important for the EU, but it's very important for the cause of defending liberal democracy. It is a strong signal that those who have defined themselves as protagonists of illiberal democracy are defeatable. And this was a big defeat. It was a huge defeat of Viktor Orban. And I think this is sending a signal which is obviously most strongest and most influential in Hungary itself, but it goes far beyond that. Now, with respect to the EU's capacity to be able to respond to the challenges, which I think is a different question. Yes, it is good news that Orban is no longer will be heading the government in Hungary because he was the chief obstructionist. He was someone who, and it had become stronger, also because he believed that this is the way to get another term in office. But he had become very obstructionist. He had been ready to boycott compromises. And even when compromises were found, as we saw in December with respect to the 90 billion loan to Ukraine, he stepped back from the compromise that had been found, which was something which had never happened before. And I don't think that someone will replace Viktor Orban in his role. So that is something which makes the EU's ability to find compromises and thus to progress. And the 90 billion loan and the decision on the 20 sanctions package, which was immediately taken thereafter, is something which points in that direction. But at the same time, many of the member states were hiding behind Viktor Orban, or hiding behind also those who were following Viktor Orban, arguing we cannot do certain things because Viktor Orban is not ready to do so, and he also has at least one or two joining him, so we cannot do ABC. And now and we always knew that, it becomes much more obvious that it's not only one country or two or three of them which can obstruct, but it's also the rest who are not ready to find a compromise themselves.
Well, indeed. And Fabian, when it comes to Ukraine, Janis mentioning there the 90 billion euro now has been approved, a hugely important moment for Ukraine, but signs on Ukrainian membership, EU membership, that now countries that had been hiding behind Viktor Orban on that issue are becoming more vocal, coming out again in the open and expressing grave doubts about whether Ukraine will actually join. So do you believe, how significant do you think this victory was for the EU's support for Ukraine broadly? And on that membership question, is that a classic example of what Janis was just talking about?
I think it's important, and Janis already said that, but I think it's important to emphasize this. This is a really important moment, and we should also celebrate this, not only because of the European implications, but because this was a thoroughly corrupt regime, which had been changing Hungarian democracy for 16 years, hollowing out Hungarian democracy. So, whatever opinions Peter Magyar might bring into this, it is a huge structural change, which we should celebrate. But even in the case of Hungary, it's not the case that we simply go from a obstructionist regime under Orban to a government which says yes to everything at the European level. We already have seen there are some question marks also in Hungary. And I think that reflects that actually, when we come to these crucial questions, like Ukraine's membership, but also a number of other questions, we have the MFF also on the agenda. We have a number of fundamental questions around defense and security, around industrial policy, that in a way, Orban was always a smokescreen, which was hiding the real debates behind it, which actually show that despite everything we have talked about over the last years, we're still not at the point where there's a real recognition that this new world we're in will require doing more things together and doing it differently than we have in the past.
Okay, let's come to whether he was a smokescreen on the MFF in a moment. We don't have any real outcome to those talks yesterday, positive talks in Brussels between Peter Magyar and Ursula von der Leyen, also with Antonio Costa on unfreezing money for Hungary. It looks as if that will come, he will come back and there will be more substantive negotiations. But so I wanted to just ask you two broad questions about this. One relates to what you said, Janis, about Orban was the chief obstructionist. And although many countries are hiding behind him, the tactics, the style that led to accusations of hostage taking, of blackmail of the rest of the EU and so on. I'm just wondering, is it very easy right now to breathe a huge sigh of relief and say, thank goodness he's gone, and forget all the conversations that were being had about what can be done more structurally to stop this happening again, to stop a member state blackmailing, hostage taking, whatever? And the second part of that question is, in a moment of good news, a rare moment of good news at the moment, whether you think there's anything pro-democracy forces across Europe can learn from Peter Magyar's victory. So first, in terms of, do we just go, phew, thank goodness that's over? Or should we have learned a lesson about things that need to change in the way the EU's run? Janis first.
I think that there are, with respect to both aspects, there are a lot of lessons that need to be learned. If you go back over these 16 years, as Fabian was reminding us, there were phases in which the reaction also of conservative leaders in Europe vis-a-vis Viktor Orban could have been different, if you remember how the EPP treated him for a long time. And that, I think, was something which at the end, accommodating him too much, helped him strengthen his position, gave him even more time at home to create the system of corruption which he did create, undermining liberal democratic principles and values, and being the front runner, as I said earlier, of liberal democracy. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned and mistakes that should not be committed again. But we see in other cases that we potentially are, again, too accommodating when it comes to those who are at least playing a double game, and we are not politically up to fighting against that. Now, when it comes to what pro-democracy forces can learn from Magyar, I think that there are a good number of lessons that one can take. First of all, the major lesson is that illiberals are also subject to people at certain point wanting a political change. That a time comes even for them where they're being challenged and where people have the feeling that there is someone new who needs to come to power. And that moment has also come in the case of Orban, which many thought 6 months ago would not happen, by the way. Second, Magyar had a positive narrative. He was not succumbing to what the other side was doing, which was fear-mongering, which was not coming up with a positive narrative as Magyar did, which was directed also to key concerns of the citizens. So he was able to reach out with a positive narrative. By the way, also towards the end of the election campaign, increasingly with a positive narrative about Hungary's membership in the European Union. So even there he was positive rather than being negative. And I think that That's something which others can learn from if you want to fight back against those kind of forces, if you want to be successful. But then there are also the lessons we will be learning now that Maggie will have to do a lot of reforms in his home country.
It'd be interesting. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of analysis, and perhaps we can come back in a broader discussion about those lessons of how you take on the illiberal forces another time. But from your perspective, Fabian, and in turn, and you said it's a huge structural change, him Orban going, that we should celebrate. But do you think, what lessons do you think the EU should draw from this period of its history?
There are many lessons which have to do also with the wider battle against the liberals. But of course, we are limited in the time we can spend on that. But I do think, coming back to a question you raised, I think it is important that we learn that if we want to not get into these blackmail situations, into these impasses, that we have to change something fundamentally, and that we should not just hope that these challenges go away by themselves, but that we actually address them proactively. And I think that's especially important because we now have a timing window of opportunity. We have the illustration of Trump. We have the threat from Russia. So all of the things should be there, which drive us to making some changes. And if we don't do it now, then I'm afraid when it comes closer to the next major elections, also in the big countries, France, Germany, where we also are seeing a real challenge, then we are just going to fall back into the inactivity which we unfortunately have displayed so far when it comes to addressing the structural causes of these problems.
Indeed. Coming back to a summit-related question, Janis, and you mentioned there was a discussion about the MFF. This week, the European Parliament has voted for a 10% increase on the budget proposed by the Commission last July, and they want to ring-fence spending on traditional areas, agriculture, regional spending, fisheries, and so on, and increase funding for new priorities like competitiveness and innovation. What were the signals? I mean, it would seem to me, given the signals we had certainly before Cyprus, that there's no chance at all of member states. They're not likely to agree the Commission's proposal, let alone 10% more. Antonio Costa said after the summit, EU leaders were, and I quote, preparing the grounds for an ambitious long-term EU budget. Are they?
Well, they have to. The question is, did they make major progress now during the informal summit? I don't see that at this moment in time. And actually, if you look into past experiences leading to previous MFFs, we know that it requires the pressure of the time and of the moment to come to a conclusion and to reach a compromise. The Cypriot presidency will present a new negotiating box in June. That's the next moment where discussions might become more concrete. But now we see that the opposing parties are positioning themselves for that moment in time, and we don't know when that moment in time will come, whether it will actually be towards the end of the year or later. There's the pressure from the French elections to do it earlier, but there's still a question mark whether that's possible. But we see that the different camps are positioning themselves, the Germans, the Dutch, Mats, very strongly arguing we cannot, in times in which we are cutting costs at home, increase the EU budget. The Parliament, as you were indicating, asking for more than what the Commission had been asking for. Everyone having criticized the Commission's proposal last July. And then there we have the other member states, led by France, Poland, Italy, Spain, who are asking for a higher budget. But these are, in very many ways, traditional camps, which have been opposing themselves for a long time. And this time around, things will not be easier than they were last time. So the progress we're making is now millimeter. And the question is, when will they reach a compromise? What kind of compromise they will reach? And I'm not very confident that we will see something which will be a revolutionary change. It will be rather something which will be tweaks here and there when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to cohesion, when it comes to investing into future-oriented policies a bit more than in the past. You will see all these kind of things, but in terms of having something which will change the next MFF logic radically, as actually probably would be necessary, I don't see that happening.
Fabian, so a fight both over the overall size of this budget and the focus where you spend the money. Do you share Janis's pessimism about a real change in the structure of the budget and where the focus? I say Parliament trying to have it both ways, as it were, by protecting the traditional areas and supporting the new areas. But given where member states are at in terms of the overall size of the budget, are you fearful we will see a budget that is very much business as usual?
Well, first we have to get to a budget at all. And I think we are still very much early on in the negotiations. I think what we are already starting to see is that the ambitious timetables which were there look unrealistic, that we will get this all done in good time before the French election. I think, yes, it would be good, but it's very hard to do because ultimately all of the old debates come back. The MFF debate around just retour, around the overall size, around the governance. We have a huge question about governance as well, about how much flexibility the Commission will have, what we do with unspent money. These are all detailed questions, but they are all very strongly felt within the finance ministries at the national level. And that makes it almost impossible to, in the end, construct a compromise. I think this time round, it will be even more difficult than in the past. And I think we have to actually think about what can we do outside the MFF to address some of the real priorities we have.
Sorry, can you clarify, expand on that briefly?
Well, I think ultimately one of the biggest problems with the MFF is structural because we have a veto for every national player. So to get to a resolution which is ambitious enough means you would have to, in some way, overcome this unity dilemma. And I think if that is not possible, then you simply have to create instruments which sit outside that governance framework which
So you
we
would take
have.
specific pots of money for specific things and do it with, to use your favorite expression, a supra-governmental avant-garde, a coalition of the willing, as it's often called, but in specific areas with specific pots of money.
Yes, as we have in the past, it's not unprecedented. For example, when you look at the euro crisis, to mobilize the necessary funding, we created the European Stability Mechanism, which is not part of the governance which we normally have for the MFF. So it is possible to do this. I think it also opens up the possibility of involving other countries in these coalitions of the willing, which are not inside the European Union, and it can address the free riding problem. Yes, that has gone a little bit less because Orban was not only the biggest objectionist, he was also the biggest free rider, in many ways a kleptocracy, which was just aiming to get as much European money as possible. But still, there's going to be the question, if we are spending more at the European level, how do we prevent that from going to governments or to countries where they don't agree with the
Indeed.
principles we're trying
Indeed.
to pursue.
Sorry, I'm going to have to bring it, but because I want just to, Janis, 2 words on the discussion on what are called own resources, and an increasing emphasis, people saying we need more EU own resources. Where do member states stand on that issue, and are there any signs of a potential landing zone to get an agreement there?
Well, we have some member states who are extremely pushing this direction. The Commission is pushing this direction. The Parliament is pushing this direction. There are other member states who are very hesitant when it comes to that. However, I would reckon that there will be some degree of movement when it comes to own resources whenever and if a compromise will be found with respect to the MFF. But I would not expect that this will be a game changer. I would not expect that this is something going to be which radically changes the income resources of the European Union. It
What
might add
sort of
new
own
elements.
resources are
Well,
being
there were
favoured in the discussion?
there were five proposals which the Commission brought forward last July, and now there is a discussion which relates, for example, to tobacco, which is something which had already been part of the compromise. So it's trying to argue plastics, that there are certain things which obviously we want to tax higher because we actually think that this is the right thing to do. But that also means that if you have these own resources, you cannot have them also at the national level. They will become European.
Indeed.
And many member states do not want to give up these kind of resources, which they can also use at the national level, and giving it over to the European level. Now, the argument from the European side is that, especially as we have to pay back for Next Generation EU, and member states are not ready to increase their own contributions. We need some other resources. And I think that argument will fly at least a bit, but again, I don't think it will be a game changer.
Okay.
Can I just one
Really brief.
sentence? I think it's interesting that we talk about spending. We talk about how to raise that spending. We don't talk about debt, which is one of the main tools. I think the European Union is going to raise common debt. I don't see any other possibility. When it comes to, for example, reconstruction in Ukraine, nobody will want to pay for that from national budgets. But once again, it might be inevitable, but we still don't talk about it.
Let us come back to that in our next discussion on the MFF, which I guess will come after the European Council in June. Just very briefly, before we close, wanted to come back to the title and the question that we posed in the title of this update about whether EU leaders can navigate the storm. I think if I could sum up what you have both been saying over the last hour, you do now believe that the need to navigate that storm is all too real and is recognised by all EU leaders. The question now is whether you think the discussions that happened in Cyprus and the ongoing discussions on these issues really signal that they have the capacity to do it. Janis, in a couple of sentences, a minute each, if you would. Are you more confident than you were that because the reality really is striking now of what we need to do, that they have the capacity to do it?
I'm not sure that I'm more confident, but if those who have been always arguing that when you have these not only but storms, perfect storm, combined out of different storms, the EU and its members is able to act, is able to find compromises, will try to find solutions. This has been the logic of those who have been arguing. Whenever that's the case, the EU and its members are able to react. So you don't need more storms, or you don't need a more difficult storm. And I would assume that what will be ahead of us won't be easier, but rather be more difficult. So the pressure on the member states is increasing. But the question is whether member states will have the ability to actually forge the compromises which are needed, whether they will have the political will and the political leadership in order to move in that direction. And that will require that certain member states will come forward and will be ready to push things. And we see, and this was already mentioned by Fabian, we have elections in France upcoming. We have elections in Germany, where the AfD probably will get stronger. So where will leadership come in order to respond to the storm adequately and not only forge compromises which at the end will not make the difference which was actually required? It's a big
Thank you.
question mark.
Fabian, last word.
It's nice to not feel like Cassandra anymore, but the recognition of the problem is only the first step. And I think what we have to see is that European leaders, and as Janis is saying, it's very hard to see where that is coming from, but that European leaders actually look at the world differently and start asking the questions again, which we asked after the Second World War. How do we address this? Not in a reactive muddling through, trying to just survive from week to week, but how do we actually get on the front foot? How do we address the issues which we are facing in a systematic, in a structural way, rather than the reactive way, where we continue to be plagued by fragmentation?
And I do hope we will come back to that in future updates. I wish we had more time because we've had so much to discuss, but thank you so much for that. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Just to mention, I mentioned that report that was published last week on the debate on the Europeanization of NATO. Do take a look at that on the website. And Fabian has published today a fascinating op-ed entitled "The Battle of Ideas is Escalating." And it looks at the role of liberal democratic think tanks in this increasingly contested environment. Really interesting stuff. Do read that if you can. Couple of events to flag up that link to what we've been talking about today. On May the 5th, a policy briefing on navigating a shock-prone world, an IMF perspective for Europe. And don't forget, June 4th and 5th, the Brussels Economic Security Forum. Really important discussions at this challenging time. That's all from us for this time. If you are in Europe and it's a bank holiday where you are this weekend, I think for most of it is, enjoy the long weekend. And if you have the sunshine that is still blessing Brussels for 24 more hours, enjoy it. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and see you next time.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Bye.